My name is Patrick McCarthy. I'm a Canadian, born on the east coast of Canada in a town called St. John, New Brunswick. I first got involved with the fighting arts in the mid-1960s. School begins in Canada in the at the end of the first week of September, Labor Day weekend. And our assembly was memorable in that we had someone who would go on to be quite a well-known Canadian singer named Buffy St. Marie. And then we were shown a documentary film by the Film Board of Canada entitled The Judoka. It focused on the career of a Canadian airline pilot, actually, named Doug Rogers. And they had highlighted his career as a competitor. He'd won the Canadian Championships, the World Championships, and they had followed him to the Olympics in Tokyo, 1964, where judo was featured for the very first time. And he was a student of the famous Kimura, and went to Japan for 6 weeks, stayed 6 years, married a Japanese. It was a very intriguing film, and very motivating for a young, I was going to say teenager, but I wasn't yet a teenager. And that served as the entry point for me. And I joined the St. John Judo Club at the time. And within that first month or so, I remember being told that the club was changing from its main location on King Street to the YMCA, where I was already a member. And but I wound up getting the dates mixed up, other times, and I wound up arriving at the dojo like an hour and a half early in the morning. And so the class was already in progress. And I remember the instructor coming over and saying, you're late, but hurry, get into class. And we weren't doing any of the normal uchikomi and break falling that I had been learning that month. We were punching and kicking, and I thought, that's probably just part of what we're doing. And the instructor then told me, he said, don't forget next Saturday it's such and such a time. And as I was leaving the dojo, actually it was the wrestling room, that / dojo, I saw my instructor from the judo club. I went, oh. And he said, what are you doing? You're early. I said, I just finished training. He goes, that was the karate class. And that's how I got involved with karate. So that was, and I think about it now, it's well past 50 years ago. So. In 1970, my father, who worked as an instrument mechanic, pipe fitter, got transferred in his job from the oil refinery in St. John to Toronto. So we had relocated from a very small town on the East Coast, on the ocean, to the literal metropolis of Canada at the time, Toronto. And so where I was from, there was only one judo club with 2 branches, and there was only the one karate club. And by the way, there would be another karate club started up, I think the other karate club started, I'm going to take a guess, I think it might have been a year after I started training. So it might have been late 1967 or 68, another club started. And that club was Chitōryu Karate, which was a branch club run by a British fellow by the name of Bob McGuinness, who I think was a yellow belt at the time himself. And they had affiliated themselves with the Homu Dojo in Toronto, which was run by Mr. Tsuroka. And so, of course, when I got to Toronto, that was the first club I reached out to and started training. And interestingly, from where I lived in Scarborough to get to their dojo downtown, I had to take a bus down to Warden Station, and then the train down to Yonge Street, and then it was a bit of a journey, and so but it was a journey of epic proportions. You know, I was a kid from a very small town, and then being in a metropolis like Toronto, with a huge Chinatown, and I mean, just the walk through Chinatown itself was an adventure every day. And in those days, I remember I found out just around the corner from a Chinese restaurant, I gathered up enough confidence to walk into it, order some food one day. I found behind that, on 14 Hagerman Street, was another Kung Fu club called the Qingmo Association, Qingmo Gun. It was run by Jack Chin and Jimmy Lore. And they were kind of a sub-branch of Hongar, Hakka-style boxing. And then down the street a little bit further, on the left-hand side, was the Canadian Karate Kung Fu Association. And they had taken Chito-ryu karate and fused it with Southern Chinese Kung Fu Hongar. And then across Spadina Avenue on the north side, there was yet another Kung Fu club named Hong Lak Kung Fu Club. And then back a little bit on Spadina, just around the corner of Spadina, was the Pagoda Theater. And so to go downtown to the karate dojo every weekend, there were places to stop and visit, and things to eat, and shops to look in, and books to read, and then movies to see. 75 cents, I could sit and watch a morning a matinee, and then hide under the chair, you know, the crowd left, and come back and watch the same movie. And then on the way home, you know, fight my way through the forest after I get off the bus to get to my neighborhood, you know, breaking branches off of trees and swinging and fighting imaginary enemies. I was really super passionate about that. You got to remember that as well is, you know, I'm just like 15 at the time, and that we're just moving into the Bruce Lee had already done a couple of films, but they never made it to the Western world, and at that time, his message was speaking very, very loudly to we enthusiasts who were looking to be like Bruce Lee. You know, we didn't want to be. We wanted to actually be Bruce Lee. You know, and so there wasn't enough that we could do. Magazines, books, and there weren't many books or magazines in that era. There was Black Belt magazine. There was the book written by our friend George Mattson on Uechi Ryu. There was a book that my karate instructor was using when I was just a kid, 11, 12 years old. And by the way, he was only a green belt at the time in Kyokushin karate, and I always used to notice, but only in retrospect, that every few minutes he'd go away and go up to the showman area and look in. I knew he was looking in the book. It was the 1957 Oyama Masatatsu, What is Karate? Of course, I still have the book these days, by the way. That's a collector's item. You know, where you learn the next lesson out of the book and then you came and taught it type of thing. So, but the karate of the 1960s, as I recall, was very plebeian. I mean, very, you lined up. We went through our rendition of Mokso, and then, of course, the Shoman Sensei and the Otagai ni courtesy. A warm-up that you would probably be put in jail for, ballistic to say the very least, then. Countless punches, countless repetitions of walking up and down the floor with, you know, Geramrai, Tomiko Mitsuke, Maigeri, Mashigeri, Ushirogeri. I don't know, sorry, Ushirogeri. There was no Ushirogeri. That would come many years. I've never seen a spinning heel kick until I get caught with one in the face in Buffalo, New York. story for another time. Actually, why not tell it now? You asked me about competitions. In those days, we were very lucky to have in the Toronto area some of the top fighters in the country. And one of them was a young man by the name of Wally Slokey. And Wally would go on to really make a name for himself in sport karate. He would put Canada on the map for a country to be reckoned with as far as international competitors was concerned. And he often helped mentor many of us young students from other dojos. And I was lucky that that I was one such athlete. And a short story is, anyway, he took us to Rochester, New York for a tournament. And so from Toronto, when you go down to the Great Lakes, you know, it's Erie, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse. All of these areas are within just a couple of hour drive of Toronto. So we were at tournaments every single weekend. So one of my first, and I got my shodan in 1979. And so one of my very first fights as a black belt was against an American, and these were open competitions, right? Anybody from styles could fight. And I was fighting against a guy named Joe Hayes. And I had no idea who Joe Hayes was, by the way. And I remember from the sidelines, "Come on, Pat, get him!" And I remember giving courtesy and standing back in a position. And then the next thing, I was just looking up. And Sensei Slok goes over me and goes, "Hey, come on, you're okay. Let's get up. Let's go." I'd been hit with a jumping spin back kick, and I'd never seen it before. And I can only remember at the end, and of course, so I lost the fight right away. But later I would find out that Joe Hayes actually was someone who trained with Bruce Lee. And that was the era it was on then. And the message of that era was, rid yourself from the classical mess. Take what is functional, leave the rest. Now, that was not a message we were going back to our dojo and saying, "Hey, you should forget that, sensei." You know, in those days, of course, you were, because our tradition is protected by Confucian etiquette. The idea of looking outside your style, or thinking outside the box, or lo and behold, go to another dojo, was totally out of the question. If you did that, then that was considered by this Asian protocol as terribly disloyal and extremely disrespectful to the heritage of the legacy of the pioneers who had handed down your style. And while we were honoring that on one side, on the other side, we were training at other schools. And so it was a very, very interesting time. So that era of competitiveness, if you will, brought out best and the worst in everybody and everything. I mean, the real essence of adversarial training, in my opinion, is not so much about overcoming the other guy, as much as it's about overcoming yourself. And but there was such a dichotomy, such a conflict in our beliefs. On the one hand, you got to remember, we've just come out of the first decade of the fighting arts being introduced to the Western world. Okay, look. Okay, sorry. So the anthropologists out there might, or the historians might say, yes, well, jiu-jitsu was around in the 40s or 50s, and maybe it was. But I guarantee if that type of thing was around, it was like, oh, did you? Oh, I learned it in the army. It was like, they used to call them jiu-jitsu tricks and things like that. But so the karate did not surface, even though you've got guys like, say, Ed Parker and Bob Trias and people like that, who come out of the 50s, learning in the 50s, and maybe they were teaching in the 50s. karate never really became part of the public image until the early 60s. Black Belt Magazine's first issue, for example, 62. And no rival magazines, of course, you know. Yeah, of course, there were articles that came out in Popular Mechanics and I think I actually have a copy of one in 1957, you know, where they'd introduced somebody. So we're not saying it wasn't around, but as a phenomenon, and the people had heard of it, not until the 60s. So I came out of the first generation. Now, I was just a kid, where a lot of people who I know today, who were adults back there, you know, they always said to me, Patrick, how come you're still so young? They're like 85 years old now. I said, well, it's because I was 20 years younger than you when I started, you know, at the same time. And the interesting part about that entire era was there was, you know, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to remember that, for the most part, people who brought karate back to the United States, the Western world, Europe, Canada, were soldiers, military people, who had been stationed in Japan or somewhere in Asia. And certainly, look, there's always been, I mean, from the very late 1800s, maybe turn of the century, with Chinese, and then, of course, after the Koryū Act in 1900, Japanese/Okinawans, coming into the West Coast to work in those types of jobs that other people didn't want to handle. So the Chinatowns, or the Japantowns of that era, always had martial arts, but it was it was a closed community. I don't think the outside the Western community knew what was going on, or if they did, it was by rumor only. And maybe in a very, very special set of circumstances, someone may have known what was going on, maybe through a blood relation or something. But you know, you get someone like Bruce Lee, whose story has been told on many times, advocating that Western people should be able to learn. And then soldiers who were stationed here in Okinawa, or in other places, in Korea or somewhere, like Chuck Norris, for example, coming back and then starting school, so passionate about the allure, the myth of this fighting art, that they wanted, that's all they wanted to do, nothing else. And I understand that very well. I too got caught by that, and at a very young age. And so that kept me deeply interested in the pursuit. So on the one hand, I had this very, you know, traditional school and set of rules that you only do this and you must do that. And no, your ankle has to be articulated this way. And although explained theoretically to me, we never actually saw the function of it, because it was told, if you did this ski correctly, that person would die. Or this chop, or this application of kata, you know. You never actually physically imagine doing it, because at the end, you know, we go through typical three-style kata, up and down the floor doing repetition of basic technique over and over again. That would prelude to yakusoku, sorry, one step, two step, and ultimately three step before we got to yakusoku kumite, a prearranged fighting. And then, of course, the climax of all of the classes was kumite. And after kumite, you did kata. And kata in the 60s was something that you did as a prelap to doing a test to going to the next level of recognition. And you know, as you know, I've done a lot of interviews over the years, and I can remember not so long ago interviewing the gentleman who introduced karate to the UK, Dr. Vernon Bell. And I remember asking, and he, by the way, he brought karate in 1957. He had been training across the ditch in France with Mochizuki Minoru's son, Hiro. And they brought this karate over before the first Japanese would come, which would be Kanazawa Sensei. Right? And I said, Sensei, please tell me something about Oh, yes, I remember those very difficult years, you know. I remember my Shodan test very well. I had to do Pinan Nidan 5 times. And I go, excuse me? And I remember, but in 1957, you know, to do some Ippon Kumite, a little bit of free sparring, maybe some Tamishiwara, a breaking of something, and then Kumite, that was a big deal. You know, that was a big deal. That was. So the controversy begins when other people start offering you advice into the way they see things. And this is where you see that wall of protectionism, of course, be it from insecurities or be it from protection. Take your pick. And Bruce Lee said this and this. Take from that, discard the rest and do this. Get your freedom. And of course, all the traditionalists, if they thought that this was the right thing to do in the early 1970s, they'd have done it. But they weren't, because they were locked into it's done this way. And because, and only in retrospect when I look back, part of that dichotomy was the fact that he was a larger than life online, probably that's anachronistically incorrect. He was a movie star at the time on the big screen. And of course, he could end every street fight with a spinning heel kick, you know. Now, you and I both know that a spinning heel kick, it's only going to get you in trouble in a fight, you know. But of course, because of our naivety of how it really worked, we saw that and we wanted to do that. And because we weren't getting it in Chito-ryu or Shotokan, or even Hangar, Wing Chun, or Topai, we wanted that. And so that was what cracked open the door for a look at something outside the box. And it was the tournaments. And remember, it's the early 70s. It's like the Woodstock of karate martial arts. When you went to Woodstock, I mean, there was Joan Baez, Jimi Hendrix, everybody was. You got every type of music you could think in 3 days of fun music. When you went to an American-style open tournament of that era, this is before they were flying around with tinfoil swords, of that era, you got everybody. Various schools of Taekwondo, every type of Southern style of Kung Fu you can imagine. Wing Chun, Dopai, Hangar, Hong Sing Choi, Boxing Choi, Hongar, all the different crane schools, all your Kempos, you know, American Kempo, Kachi Kempo, all the breakaways of, say, Ed Parker's group, and then of course you had every type of karate, Shodo Waragoju, and then of course you had the beginnings of eclectic American-style karate, but still very tough fighters. Isshin-Ryu played a huge role in the early years of American karate as well. So it was kind of a melting pot. And everybody got along with everybody. You know, you had no problem. You know, and the fighting, for those watching this presentation, if you have not seen some of the, what is affectionately referred to as the blood and guts era of what I'm talking about, have a look at it. YouTube it. Pretty messy stuff. But what I liked about the messy stuff was it was random, unscripted, and learning how to effectively negotiate it required you to be on the floor, putting your ass on the line. And I grew up with that. And so I came to think of that, if we can use that as a microcosm of the larger whole, then I thought karate was like that all over the world. And I began to expand my parameter of competition through the group that I associated with in those days. And one day, I remember well, my classmates were now Hanshi Kentalik from Canada, Master Bruce Curry, also from Canada. And there are others from our group, not so many who've maintain training to this area. Other young men like Mike Atkinson, we used to remember Alex Atkinson, John Atkinson that day. But that group of people, we kept going to Rochester, New York, Erie, Pennsylvania, around the surrounding areas until we got word of some competitions on the West Coast, in Florida, out east, out west. And we would venture to those. And we would gain valuable learning and bring it back. And the only one who wasn't so happy about that was the sensei, because it wasn't from their nest. So in 1973, I got an opportunity, I like to use the term in Russian, to run away with the circus, as it were. I met, my apologies, 1972, I met Daniel Kane Pai, who'd run an organization called Pai Lemon Kung Fu Organization. And a group of us were invited to go to train, become kind of a live-in Uchideshi students to help teach at his dojo in the United States. And that was our first time to leave the nest, so to speak, and to travel abroad. And that was such a wonderful era. The traveling, the meeting of like-minded people, the thrill and the enthusiasm of cross-training. I mean, gosh, at one time I was learning Wing Chun, and not just, a move or two, but I mean, I learned Siu Lam Tao, Cham Kyu, Biu Ji, the Lok Dim Bun Guan, Wu Li To, Chi Sao, and 80, 90 ways of using the Mukjong as well. I had friends there. We were doing Eagle Claw, Chin Na, Hungar, of course, which is my favorite. 1974, we got a wonderful opportunity to go to New York to watch the very first Shaolin Wushu troupe ever came to North America. It was a sensational golden era. But anyway, I was mentioning the trip about getting involved with the Pai Lum movement. And as I say, Kent Alec, Bruce Curry, and myself, not all at the same time, went to different parts with the Fire Dragon Kung Fu Association. And I spent most of 1973 in Hartford, Connecticut, and Morgantown, West Virginia, and certainly, and Pennsylvania, and places, New York, for tournaments and things like that with Grandmaster Pai. And I remember coming back home for Christmas to my parents in Canada. And then in early January getting my ticket, Allegheny Airways, DC-9, getting at Pearson Airport in Toronto to fly back to the United States. I'm a kid, I'm like a teenager with a backpack, about $25 in my pocket, and a one-way ticket. You didn't need a passport in those days to travel, just a driver's license, birth certificate. I remember immigration saying, "Where are you going?" Just going down to visit friends, or, in so-and-so. "What are you doing there?" "Doing karate, sir, "Oh, you're one of those karate guys." "Well," I said, "actually doing some kung fu as well, "How long are you staying for?" I said, "Oh, no. We started talking about karate. I thought, well, he's really interested in karate. So I was telling him, I'm training with Dr. Pai, and he says, "You're not going." He says, "You don't have a return ticket, you have no money, you're Canadian, you're not American, and you have no job. Here's your ticket, go back home." Oh, I was, I didn't know what to do. I was really, and I remember contacting a friend of mine. He was 2 years below me in the school system. He was up at Cedar Brae and I was at Laurier Collegiate. And we were both on gymnastics team, wrestling at the same time. Just different. He was junior, I was a senior. And he was like my student, His name was Ron Beer. Ron, hi. Ron is still actively involved. He's the head of shoot wrestling in Canada, by the way. I said to Ron, I said, "I've been gone, better part of a year. I can't go back to the States now. I don't know what to do." And he goes, "Oh my God, this is like fate. I said, well, why? He said, well, in your absence, I've been training at a Kung Fu club on 1561 O'Connor Drive in East York. It's called Yaolong Kung Fu Center. And I went, okay, so what? He goes, well, he said there were three Chinese, Bill Zhong, Wu Long Ong, and Mo Chao were running this Kung Fu school together. And one of them is no longer part of the group. And I went, okay. He said, so they're looking for a chief instructor. You'd be perfect for the job. And I went, okay, can I get an interview? He arranged to get me an interview. I went down, I met with this guy, Bill Zhong and Wu Long Ong. And so they could have been offering a job to clean dishes. I would have taken it, okay. Just let's get something straight. That I was going to be the chief instructor. Anyway, there's a little bit more of the story than BCI, but that was basically how I get in the door to become a third partner in a new martial arts school. And that went on, and I spent an entire year there. And I got to know my professional colleagues well. Cesar Borkowski, Willie Slokey, Alex Atkinson, Ron Yamel, all the people of that era, really quite well. And then one of my students at the Yaolong Kung Fu Center, his name was Howie Farrell. And Howie was the chief instructor for the fitness group of a big chain of fitness centers in Canada of the era called Vic Tanny's. I'm sure some of the older listeners will remember that chain of fitness centers. They went on to be called something else. I think they called themselves Super Fitness in the 80s or something. But in that era, they were the leading chain of health and fitness centers throughout Canada. And he was the head instructor for the fitness part of it. And he said, why are you here doing this? And by the way, I have one foot in the door doing traditional Chinese Kung Fu. I had one foot in the door, I loved Wushu at the time. I had another foot in the door doing Sandao, which was a kind of a fighting version of it. In my mind, I always wanted to be Bruce Lee. And then I was out at these blood and guts karate tournaments, So it was really a convoluted area. And so the idea that you could be out with a group of people doing your own thing was very, very special, but very frowned against, you see. And Howie said to me, and I think in those days I was making about $175 a week was my salary. Mind you, my salary was larger, but because I had no money to buy into the club, the $5,000 that I had to put in to be a partner, I didn't have. So I think they were actually paying me $300 a week, to keep you $150, and the $150 for me, I was sleeping in the dojo, and that went toward my ownership, so to speak. So Howie is offering me a job at Vic Tanny's for $350 a week, all of which I could keep for myself, by the way. And my job would be to travel around with there are 27 clubs in southwestern Ontario, Quebec, to teach what would now be called, say, floor classes, aerobic classes, which in those days had not yet been invented. But the idea of putting a group of people together on a class-by-class basis to do a makeshift martial art-like training class to then cultivate your own students on the side, which it was totally, I would have done it for free, probably, And that began my a 5-year relationship with Vic Tanny's. And interestingly enough, I would meet my partner there. She was actually the boss of the chain, and so it turned out to be an extremely wonderful learning experience at the time. And it was during that period of time where we're not in a confined style, so to speak, that I like to use the term that we will talk about Richard Kim in a moment, who was a very influential role model in my life. Used the term, he said, Patrick, I'm going to kick open the floodgates of intelligence and drowned you in the depth of your own ignorance. So I don't even know what that means, but that's exactly what he did. And the prelude to that was to work with this group of people of that era who were all my seniors, but who were all reaching for something greater than what they had. And I'll never forget them. People like Master Monty Guest. Certainly Soroka Sensei would come back into my life a little bit later on and play an important role. Well, Wally Slokey, of course, invaluable. And not just in the fighting as well, but in the just in life in general. You know, we've talked before, James. You know me. I came from a very dysfunctional family, and not at the time. Nobody knows you're with a growing up in a dysfunctional family. I thought we were having a wonderful time, by the way. But you know, lacking that paternal role model in one's life, and then seeking to fill that void, if you will, with other male role models. You know, so I loved motorcycles. So it would be natural that I would gravitate toward, you know, hanging out with guys who were club members, you know, with motorcycle gangs. But I loved the music of the 60s, you know, the Beatles and pop rock but you know, but then hard rock as well. So, you know, it was kind of a leather jacket, but with a cut-off jean jacket as well, with long hair, you know. So you could be kind of tough and cool all at the same time. And nowhere was that more applicable than having the balance of the fighting arts as a foundation to help guide you in life. And by the late 1970s, I had gone through, you know, classical training, open style training, mixing and matching of cross training in every area that you could possibly imagine. And I kept hearing about, you know, this historical, philosophical, holistic, pedagogical, spiritual part of the art. I'd certainly seen it in movies. I was an avid reader. It's one of the only few things I've ever got from education was the value of reading. And so I read everything there was to read, but as I said, there wasn't that much in those days. And so this opportunity came. Wally Slokey said to me, there's going to be a seminar, October 1977 in Hamilton, Ontario, which is an hour and a half, 2 hours drive from me. A guy named Richard Kim from the Butoku Kai is going to be giving a week-long symposium. So I called the guy who was hosting it, and I said, look, I'd like to go. And he said, you're more than welcome. And I went. And that was a changing point in my life. You know, there are interesting things, I'm sure. We were speaking the other day about the transitions of a person's life, and that there are key points that whether you get them at the time or it's in retrospect that you look back and say, that was a transitional time in my life. I was moving out of one area of thought, and I was gradually being gravitated toward another area of thought. I wouldn't really be able to quantify what it was, although I could sense it, I could feel it. But I couldn't put my finger on what exactly it was. And that was definitely a Richard Kim transitory point. So Richard Kim, I wasn't ready for him. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. I was actually totally ready for him. I just didn't know that I was ready for him. You know, look, I'd seen a lot of great, very skillful martial artists as a young man, and very few of them were Chinese or Japanese. They were Americans. Sorry, non-Asians. And so that every time I saw an Asian who was really good, I was like, wow, that's this guy is, you know. But I'd only ever heard the stories, you know, about the old master, and, the meditation and the value of introspection and all of this wonderfully provocative historical, philosophical, spiritual, holistic, pedagogical elements, but I'd never met anybody who could do it. Richard Kim was one such person. And really, honestly, from day one, I've just made a wonderful connection with him. And I was so happy that we hit it off so well. And he literally brought me into the inner circle almost immediately. And many of his inner circle, very serious and wonderful young people. And I think one of the interesting things that caught my attention entering into the organization of the Zenbei Buto Hokai was how many older members there were. I was a young guy at the time, very competitively oriented, and never really saw much interest in that side of the Bunryodo side of things. And look, and with no disrespect intended, but as a young man and fighting kata weapons was my thing. I would look at some of the guys, they're helpless, And so I didn't mean to say I ignored them, but I kind of gravitated toward the members who were like me. They were alpha athletes, and I built friendships there, In retrospect, I should have built friends the other way around, And something about youth, wasted on the young. That would be a lesson for later in life, But I didn't see the physicality and the competitiveness in his group that I had experienced everywhere else. And I liked that because there was no threat to your insecurities. Everybody liked each other. I wasn't used to people complimenting you, In the world I had grown up in, it was so competitive, there was so much rivalry that people were not, you would win a million things, but nobody said thank you or you did a great job. It was, guy won, So I learned something in that group that I had not experienced before, and it was very nice, a great feeling. And Mr. Kim introduced for me what I had missed from having grown up in, say, Japan or China or, say, Okinawa, where group instruction here is not the same as group instruction in the Western world. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but it is much of an industry as well in the Western world, not everywhere, and we certainly have good friends who embrace this tradition as a family, But I just, as a rule, students come and go, there's members of the dojo, and then there are students. And then there are those inner students who become like family to you. And I experienced that for the first time with them. I can remember speaking with Sensei Kim hours on end about him telling me about what it was like when he was a young man training in Hawaii. His father was Korean, his mother was Japanese. And, coming from Hawaii, and, born in 1917, he was a young man when guys like Motobu Choki, Miyagi Chojun, Yabukensu had come to Hawaii. And he would tell us about that, and he would tell us about his own instructors. And then, of course, Mr. Kim, you can read about this in books written about him, was an agent during the war and traveled through China as well. And so he would tell us about the training of that era, the value of not specializing in any one thing, but learning everything. He taught me the value of Onko Chishin, for example. Why history is so important, he said, is not just for the simple fact that you will learn not to repeat the mistakes that it has made in your own future, but you will understand how and why things are the way they are, and subsequently what forces affected their growth and direction, so you will know why it is the way it is today. And when you understand, irrespective of what else the fighting arts can be, a form of physical fitness, a competitive element, judged only by rules and regulations, which serve as the methods which to train to achieve those outcomes. Of course, it can be a business or an industry, if you will, but first and foremost, it evolved out from and was cradled in the idea of self-protection. So one thing, irrespective of where you come from in the world, and irrespective of your gender, your age, your nationality, your cultural heritage, the acts of physical violence, which are considered habitual in human nature, are common to all social communities everywhere on the planet. So the mechanics that govern movement of limbs, transfer of kinetic energy, equaling force, are common. And it becomes the common thread which weaves together the functionality of the arts that bring us together. And that's what Richard Kim taught to me through the proverbs of Onko Chishin and the value of Bunbu Ryodo. The pen and the sword in constant accord. Not just the pen is mightier than the sword. Or not just that well, I can remember speaking to you. One day we were coming back from near Mateoshi coffee plantation. Where was it? We were dune bugging. What's it called?
Coat bug.
Right. And we were coming through Nago, and it just struck me. I went, oh, have you ever heard of Teijun Soku? And you went, no. And I went, oh my God. I mean, really. It was just so, Nago, because he was Nago Oyakata. And there was his statue. And I went, pull over, we gotta go there. And it was beside their museum, and we pulled over, and there was, Jun Soku was there, and he's sorry I'm talking to our listeners right now. Nago Oyakata was originally here from Kume, and he was one of what we refer to here in the Ryukyu Kingdom as, then in the Ryukyu Kingdom, as a sanshikan, one of the top 3 levels of ministers under the king. Basically, they control the culture. And he was also known as father educator, and a very strong advocate of the fighting arts, and working with young people of the era, that he said, it's not enough that your fighting art is strong when in contrast to your daily behavior in life. There has to be a balance. And it's so remarkable that we drove by there. But so that idea of learning something other than just the punching and kicking, the fighting application, there's a body of moral philosophy that serves to govern the behavior of we who would embrace these otherwise dangerous practices. And Richard Kim laid that foundation for me. And I was at the same time continuing on with my competitive era. And then 2 years later, in 1979, my female partner at the time was also working in the film industry. And our Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, had passed a bill. Let's see if my photographic memory gets it. Bill 88, the CRTC bill. Any foreign country could come to Canada and shoot their film projects at 100% tax write-off, providing they use 80% Canadian content. Well, with a film crew, it's perfect. The director only brings his principals with him, and the leads. Everybody else they hire, lighting, camera, not camera, but lights, sound, cattle calls, special business extras, they get them on the spot. And hotels, transportation travels were great. So we relocated to Vancouver, and which was the Hollywood of the North in that era. I set up my dojo right away. She set up Central Casting Canada with her business partner. And that was another remarkable change. I remember learning a term from Sensei Kim that I had never heard of her before. You know, I love the English language. I love massaging its grammar. And he caught me off balance with this. Oh, he said, "You're in Vancouver now." Yeah. Yeah, you'll suffer what is commonly known as the ultra pre-Montan prejudice. And I went, what's that? So what I would come to know is ultra pre-Montan, that the people on one side of the mountain would either know nothing about or completely misunderstand the nature of the people on the other side of the mountain, and vice versa. And nowhere was that more evident than in the fighting traditions. Nobody in Western Canada knew anybody in Eastern Canada. And people in, Central and Eastern Canada, well, first of all, people in Eastern Canada didn't know people anywhere else, by the way. And people who flocked to its metropolis, Toronto, didn't think too much outside there. Even though most people from Toronto come from other places. Vancouver was just a remarkable, and I remember in the beginning, I actually didn't want to go. And once I got there, I never wanted to leave. It was an absolutely fantastic place. But once again, it would serve two purposes. And by the way, let me just back up a little bit. Way back in my judo years, there were two really quite famous judo instructors that would come to our school infrequently, but nonetheless come. And I myself didn't really remember them by name, but it would only be later that I looked and went, oh my God, I know who these people are. Was John Blooming, as you know, the Dutchman, who was the rival of Anton Geesink. And Anton Geesink was the person who defeated one of my early mentors, which was Doug Rogers, in the film debut, The Judoka. The judoka leading up to the Olympic Games won everything, but was only ever defeated by one guy. That was Anton Geesink, the Dutchman. And this was Dutchman number 2, John Blooming, who was also a really strong karateka, Kyokushin karateka, who broke off on his own, by the way. So John Blooming would come to do seminars, and Professor Wally J., who had been assistant Olympic judo coach to Willie Cahill in the United States. So when I went to Vancouver, because I was on the West Coast, I was much closer to both Richard Kim and Professor Wally J. in San Francisco, Alameda actually. And the West Coast had a completely different feel and texture. A very large Chinese community, by the way, and Japanese community. And so I got involved with a group of people there that were totally unlike the group from where I had previously come. And not so competitively oriented, but much more concerned with the cultural heritage and the legacy handed down by the pioneers. And that opened up another wonderful doorway for me. And it was through that I started to kind of detach from the competitive part and look more deeply into the heritage. Fighting arts as a lifestyle, as a way of life. And that became another crossroads. And by the time 1985 came along, I just, I've had it up to here with the competitive. Not that I thought there was anything wrong with competition. And in principle, to this day, I still think it's wonderful. We probably wouldn't have this conversation had it not been for the competition aspect. People ask me about the Olympics, and they always refer to judo, what's happened to judo. And I think that's a very unfortunate thing. But at the same time, I still think it's one of those, they say, lesser of two evils type of thing. Because of that, judo and karate get so much recognition that people who might not have an opportunity to come involved with the fighting arts become involved with it. Not because they want to go to the Olympics, I don't know anybody who's ever taken up karate or judo because I want to go to the Olympics. It's usually for something else, maybe self-defense or a cultural recreation, or it's generally not for competition. Those are things you learn, depending on which club or which group you get involved with. So as I started to move away from the competitive aspect, and not with a good feeling with regards to its politics, and this other door opened. And in 1985, two dear friends of mine, Hanchi Ken Talik and Shihan Jim Sylvan. Jim sadly just passed away just a couple of months ago. We said, let's go to Okinawa. We went, just like that, literally. Within a few weeks of planning, we got on a plane. None of us could speak. Oh, sorry, Jim could speak one word of Japanese. It was daijobu. Our entire conversation everywhere was daijobu. Oh, daijobu. Oh, daijobu. Do you speak Japanese? Oh, daijobu. It's amazing what daijobu, one word, and a lot of enthusiasm will get for you. But that was the next crossroads for me. I didn't want to leave. So I'd been asked, why Okinawa? What are you looking for? And that's another great question. I'd alluded to it earlier about, this is probably a little bit difficult. I wasn't probably able to quantify it at the time. Now, in retrospect, I have no problem to quantify it and explain it. But let me try to express it in a more organic way. I'd had enough of the competitive, and by the way, when I say enough, please keep in mind that I had been competing at tournaments since the early 1970s. And I mean hundreds of them, I mean, every weekend I competed at either one or two tournaments. I traveled extensively. I was part of the rating system before it became a rating system. And then as a Karate Illustrated magazine began their point system, I became part and parcel of that. So it was nothing for me to fly to, say, Chicago for a weekend, leave on Thursday, arrive Thursday night, spend Friday training, socializing, Saturday, Sunday for the event, come back either Sunday night or Monday. And then Thursday night, we'd go somewhere else, go to California or out to Montreal or somewhere, every week. And I had to do that as well to keep in the, I was always in the top 10 rating, in the top 10 fighters, top 5 kata, top 5 weapon, sometimes first. In order to do that, you had to, you had to conform to certain protocols by the magazine companies and by the tournament promoters. There was more to it than just going to compete, especially if you were a rated competitor, because you were receiving a stipend and transportation or hotel or some prize money as well. So I had enough of that. And what was I looking for? I don't know. I didn't feel fulfilled. It's just like Groundhog Day. Taught the classes, carried on a relationship that wasn't deep or meaningful with members I probably wouldn't see. I didn't say students, with members in my school who would come and go. And I'd heard there was more. I was reading David Lowery's writings early in those years, just his magazine articles. Don Dreger's group was part of an organization I became a member of to get their newsletters. I was looking for something with some meat on it, something that would help develop my soul and my spirit. Richard Kim had said it many times to me, McCarthy, you're a great fighter, You're spiritually hollow. What's that mean? It wasn't a good meaning. And so I suppose in retrospect, that's what I was looking for. I was looking for something to become more alive, become associated with the rapture, associated with just training. I had something already that was conditioning my body. I needed something to cultivate the mind and to nurture the spirit. And what I got when I came to Okinawa, and remember, I'd never been to Japan before. 1985 was the first time. So I knew nothing of Japanese culture, other than what karate had given me. And keep in mind, we now know, of course, that the fighting arts are a microcosm of the culture from where it comes. It's a miniature representation of its social values, etiquette, customs, protocols, and so on. But that only remains true is if whoever is mentoring you at the school understands the culture. And if they do not, then it's an imitative behavior and the trickle-down effect that perpetuates whatever mindset it is that they're in. So when I got off the plane here, I had no understanding of tatemai or honne. And I was amazed at how friendly everybody was. And we weren't here for a week. We were here for months. We spent the entire summer here. I didn't want to leave. That was a really transitional point for me. Within a year of that, I would meet the love of my life. Japanese girl. Marry and live in Japan. And not leave for 10 more years. Learn the language, the culture, the customs. Begin to embrace those values that I had heard about from Mr. Kim, but not really jump on board to do them. But now in this culture, I was able to do that. And even more importantly was because I was going to live in Japan, Richard Kim said, then if you're gonna live in Japan, then you're gonna also have to train with one of my former instructors. And he wrote the letter for me to meet Kinjo Hiroshi Sensei. And as you know, another Okinawan who lived on the mainland. And fortunately for me, he didn't live very far away. And so I went from not knowing anything about the culture to being totally immersed in the culture. And then becoming part of the culture. And you can't, so I mean, I came around 30 years old, and then I left at, say, 40 years old. Okay, that's a quarter of your life. Now, admittedly, I was an adult when I already came here. But you can't live somewhere for a quarter of your life without it having a big impact on you. And Japanese culture is diametrically opposite to the West. And so I remember by the time I had the opportunity to first step foot outside Japan, I'd been here for already like 7 years. And the first opportunity I got to teach a seminar was Sensei Terry O'Neill from your country, England, inviting me. I showed up with a blue blazer, a bow tie, gray slacks, 2 big suitcases filled with omiyagis, And those guys had just finished work in Liverpool from the pub. Gary Spires, Martin, the gun guy, Dennis Martin, Gary Spires, Terry O'Neill, there to greet me. And talk about, and it was a remarkable meeting and encounter. And but it was the meeting that changed again everything for me. So that was the third transitional point for me. And I had all these years of research now, and by the way, research, because of where we are located geographically to, say, to the peninsula, to China, to Taiwan, Southeast Asia, I traveled everywhere. Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, Fujian, Guangdong, Shanghai, Shaolin, Beijing, everywhere in pursuit of better understanding that which had become my chosen field. To meet and train with as many senior authorities as I possibly could, to get a better grip on what it was that separated us and what it was that brought us together. What were the common threads that wove together the fabric of the fighting arts? How did these people think differently from those people? Were they in pursuit of something else? And so that pathway for me, again, became a very big learning experience. And I discovered that rather than speaking to people who were 2 or 3 or 4 generations removed from the source, why not just go to the source? And so that became a focal point, going to the source. And because, the joke in my life was I'd never had a real job in my life, and I'd always just been involved with the fighting arts. And because I wasn't, and I don't mean this to come out the wrong way, and I don't mean to say that, it's not that I had never been loyal to someone or something. I didn't have a lot of good experiences with people. I was a champion, and I think people looked at me a different way because of that. There's positive and negative discrimination. I may have been receiving a lot of positive discrimination from it, which is good. I'm not complaining. But if I wasn't, say, a champion, they would have maybe never treated me that way. And so when I would go to meet these other people, I think a lot of the reasons why I was welcomed with open arms was because I was a somebody. And that made a difference. And I used that to my advantage. If my celebrity was going to open up a door to allow me to get in to get something that maybe somebody else hadn't got, I was going to do it. And I was in no way ever going to be disrespectful to that, because I wanted to benefit from whatever empowered this person, school, style, organization. And I wanted to become the recipient of that empowerment. So I cultivated friendships with many groups. And I thought, one guy always stood out in my research in karate, and it was Matsumoto Soko. So 1809 to 1899, he lived a very full life, the Miyamoto Musashi of the Ryukyu Kingdom, if you will. And while he didn't actually say these words himself, when I got a hold of his 1882 7 precepts of fighting, and then his 1885 Zayunome, which basically is a poem that describes, when someone is totally confident about what it is they know, there's always an inner calm. And the 7 principles of Bu are exclusively Confucian-based, typical beliefs of that era, mixed with the Teijin Soku tenet, fused with what I had read in Funakoshi's work, Motobuchoki's work, Babuni Kenwa's work, Nakasone Genmo's work. All of these people were circling around in my mind. I'd formed this story, if you will. It's the way my mind works. I create stories about historical events, and I try to link them together in a chronological order so I can have so I help quantify what it is was going on. And then I want to understand, to contrast it with what's going on in other surrounding cultures at the same time. It gives me a better picture of what it is that brings us together. But Matsumura, who had, as you know, studied on the main line, been to China, was an inspirational and innovative mind of his era. I made a deduction. And even though he didn't say these words exactly, it's what I It's how I paraphrase what he wanted to say, and if only to me. And it was something like this. One of the biggest distractions I faced as a young man in training was my ego. And I discovered it wasn't just me. Everybody, especially alpha athletes, depending on the type of mentorship that they have, often go down this pathway. And he said this: if you are distracted by ego-related issues, let humility, the cornerstone upon which the fighting arts rests, serve to remind you to place virtue before vice, values before vanity, and principles before personalities. And that spoke loudly to me. And so what I mean to say is, I wanted to replace personal loyalty with people I was wanting to be friends with. I wanted to be part of their group. I wanted to be liked by them. I wanted to hang out with them. I didn't mind training. As hard as you wanted to go, I'm all for that. But then when I saw them doing things on the side, it doesn't matter what they were doing, okay? I'm just saying that. I watched their behavior and I listened to what they said. And there was a conflict there. And that wasn't just with one or two people. That was with a lot of people. In fact, let me put it this way. That might have even been the common thing, rather than it not. And so I said, where am I going to place my loyalties? I'm going to place my loyalties there. I'm going to place them in the virtues and in the values and in the principles, because they never change. Now, I myself might not be able to live up to them, myself. I love that, what's his name? We're only human after all. Okay, so quick point. I'm having a conversation last year with a guy. It's not important who he is, okay? But his grandfather was a well-known martial artist, okay? And so I know some things about the lineage and the person and there about, the father being removed and the grandson not even being part of the thing. And this guy trying to tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. And I said, and what do you base all of this on? Well, my grandfather, and I went, you never even met your grandfather. And your father never really trained with him. He's doing like something else. So what you're part of a heavily conformist-based culture. Your practices are so overly ritualized that they've become wholly dysfunctional. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying, don't tell me about what is functional, because that my whole life is about function. So going back there, so there's this dichotomy. There's this different. And so back on that, I'm thinking, I want to put my loyalty in a forward motion, mechanized pathway that will lead me to functionality. Now, whether I ever get there or not is beside the point, because the effort will be worth the journey. And it's like when we liken what we're doing to a pathway, then it depends how far down the pathway you get before it becomes evident that the destination isn't the goal, it's the journey. So I love another thing about this culture that I may have learned it living back in Canada. I don't know. I may have. I didn't learn it there, but I've been away from Canada for a very long time. Don't forget there was 20 years in Australia as well, So I'm just saying I could have learned it there, but I didn't, and I learned it here. And we call it wabi-sabi. And wabi-sabi, for you folks listening to this, wabi-sabi, well, actually there's wabi-sabi and there's nantoke kinno. 日本語でちょっと覚えてないけど、なんか filling the cracked cup with gold。日本語で何と思いますか？覚えてないやっぱりね。大丈夫、後でですけれども。So, wabi-sabi is this perfectly imperfect mindset. So in other words, who of us are perfect, right? So we should have been having this conversation like in my 20s when I was perfect, you see. And when we're all perfect at 20, right? And, bulletproof mentality and all that type of thing, right? And of course, when you get older, and especially, I'm almost 70 now, so it's, when you look back at the life, oh my God, youth wasted on the young. But I can see now the true value. You're not striving for perfection. I don't go for that, striving for perfection stuff. And what is perfection anyway, right? Because it's different for everybody, right? But I prefer the Kaizen look at this perfectly imperfect world or self. And that is, if you can just be a little bit better tomorrow than you are today, or, jumping up 2 steps, falling back 1, you might jump up a bunch of steps and then fall down a bunch of steps as well. But as long as you're continually focused on a pathway that takes you forward with the intentions of getting a little bit better each time, and whether it's with joint lock, pressure point, takedown, strangulation, throw, grappling, groundwork, spear, nunchaku, bow, whatever it happens to be, then that is the spirit. You can call it a Shoshin spirit if you like, the spirit of, that beginner's mind, of remaining wholly enthusiastic about whatever it is you're doing, but focusing on the reality of things. I don't think the pursuit of being a world champion is really, that might appeal to such a tiny group of people in the world. And good luck to be the world champion. The pursuit of it would be a life-changing experience. But for the rest of us in the world, shouldn't this pathway be about, and irrespective of the name that you put on the style, shouldn't it be about conditioning the body? Think about it, womb to the tomb. I want to convey to anybody who looks toward me for influence or mentorship, a pathway that will condition the body, cultivate the mind, nurture the spirit. I don't want to interfere with the cosmetic appearance of their tradition or the political infrastructure of the heritage of their pioneers. I want to honor that. I want to respectfully honor that liaison. But I do want to focus on functional practices. So this is all just a wonderful learning experience for me. And as I said, it's transitional. I'm moving through various phases of my understanding, and life is going on. I'm married. I have a family. Life is wonderful. I get invited out to foreign countries to teach and talk about what I'm most passionate about, and I'm doing it with other people who are like-minded and just as passionate as I am, but maybe not with the same opportunities that I've had. And so I'm so grateful, and people want to know, well, who are all of your teachers? And I have a very long list because I read a lot. I've cross-trained with dozens and dozens of well-known instructors, and many instructors that you've never heard of. But I think I'm the one who decides what it is I'm going to learn from whichever lessons I get. And for me personally, going back to the Matsumura thing, although Matsumura is not the only person, Sensei Murphy was a remarkable teacher. And everybody, who's Sensei Murphy? And you and I both know that it's only metaphoric. He's not anybody really. He represents failure. Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will go wrong, especially when you don't want it to go wrong. And so therein lies the true lesson. Who was my teacher? Failure has been my greatest teacher. And that burning sensation of wanting to overcome and make myself better has been the motivation that keeps me in check. So anyway, I've traveled to many countries, and then every spring break in March up on the mainland, still living on, and I live in Kanagawa Prefecture in a very beautiful city near the inland sea called Fujisawa. And so every March during the school year break at the Budo University, we had what we call an international Budo symposium. It was funded by the Budokan, supported by the Momosho Minister of Education, and hosted by the Martial Art University. And there, 4 days, 3 nights, and it was basically targeting foreign nationals living in Japan. And it was an opportunity for us to gather together from all parts of Japan, and like a gashiku, stay together, train together, have a few drinks together, some karaoke together, have fun, and embrace various Japanese Budo to learn more about it, cross-trained, if you will. But it also introduced an academic part of the program where we could learn more about history, philosophy, the pedagogical part. And not just about karate, but about judo, kendo, aiki, sumo, jukendo, all of the budos. And then every year we would have a special guest. One year we had Yagyu sensei from Yagyushin Kage-ryu. Another year we had Uehara Seikichi from Motobu Udundi. Another year we had someone from Katori Shinto-ryu. And so on. And it would be in a regular lecture hall where they spoke, and we had translating services for those who couldn't speak Japanese. And then it was an opportunity after the morning break to go into classrooms and look at side studies and supporting the electromyograph, or understanding the value of musing while focusing on particular issues. So we could go into the laboratory to look at it, we could go into the science lab, or we could go and listen to another lecture, or then we could go off and either do karate and judo or kendo or whatever was training type of thing. And so one year, someone listened to me speak. And especially in the evenings, many of us would gather in the separate dojos. We'd kind of have our own training opportunities. Anyway, I get a call one time, and it's a guy from New Zealand. And he said, I'm calling on behalf of a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, who's the treasurer for the World Karate Federation with Antonio Espinosa. I said, oh, okay. What can I do for you? He said, well, we have a position available in Australia, and we're looking for somebody to come and write a program that looks at accrediting instructors. And I said, because in those days I'd helped out people in other countries look at their national coaching accreditation schemes. And not the immediate stuff like, injury management, lesson planning, not that stuff, but a deeper look at the science behind engagement and training and so on. And I said, I might be interested. They said, well, we'd like to invite you to Australia for 10 days to teach and meet us, and we'll meet you, and maybe put on some lectures, and we'll see how it goes. And I said, great. So I flew to Australia by myself. And I traveled all over, and I taught, and I met a bunch of interesting people. And they were all very passionate about this. And in that era, in the mid-1990s, Australia had not evolved as far as had the United States or Europe, for example, with the industry of the fighting arts. And they were going through a lot of growing pains. Insurance companies were not wanting to insure them or indemnify them because of, some of the instructors were literally very brutal. And there were a few case examples presented to me that had been videotaped on television of gradings where the teachers were actually physically beating up the learners. And you'd probably gone to jail for that somewhere else, and saying this is very common here, and we want to introduce a level of education to help change the mindset of those who embrace the fighting arts in order to. And I said, okay. I said, well, look, it's something very interesting, and I'll just cut to the chase because of the length of the time we have in the interview. I told him I couldn't make a decision without my family coming to see the country, so I'll just cut to the chase. So they flew us back again from Japan to Australia, and again we went around, and my family loved Australia. It's a beautiful country, very special people, and so I decided to take the job. So I came back to Japan, and then in the meantime, all the immigration documents were being prepared and so on. And then we relocated to Australia in 1995. And so it was a very long process. And look at it, it was not a process without roadblocks and stumbles and so on. But at the end of the road, we were ultimately recognized by the Minister of Education. It was a 2-year diploma program accredited by the Minister of Education, 22 subjects. And in 1997, 2 years after I took the position, I finished writing it in the Faculty of Education. It got its accreditation, and I started to deliver it at the College of Natural Medicine in Brisbane. And again, that was another thing. So because of the length of the interview today, or maybe we can come back and talk about this another time, but I want to jump ahead for a minute because I want to talk a little bit about what writing that program represented for me. Because when I first thought of this, this is great, no problem. I'm just going to take everything I know about karate and I'm going to codify it into a systematized delivery package and make some money and enjoy my new life, and yeah, it's going to be great. And I remember sitting in the faculty office, my own desk, and on my computer, and not knowing where to start. I was just going, where do I start? I have no idea where to start. And there was a wonderful lady who was, she wasn't the head of the department. In fact, to tell you the truth, she was actually retired. But she was the assistant to anybody who was writing a course. Her name was Dr. Clem West. And her PhD was in pedagogical principles. And I remember one day she said to me, Patrick, what's the matter? Are you having a problem? I said, yes, I kind of am, What's the problem? I said, I don't know where to start. I've been here for months. I shuffle papers all day long. I've got wonderful ideas. I just don't know where to start. And she goes, it's very easy. You just start with the outcome in mind, and you only have 2 years, 4 semesters. You have to break up the lesson plan in 14-week blocks. Each outcome needs assessment criteria. And then you break up the lessons. You need the sources that are going to be cited as the study modules. And then you write it. It's very simple. And I remember I just listened and went, wow, really? And then she said, and I said, well, you know, there's a lot of different types of martial arts. And she said, oh, is there? I thought they were all the same. And I got to tell you honestly, at that point, you know, and it was a very, very pensive time for me, you know. I kept looking at similarities and differences and so on. And, you know, I was very confused by the cosmetic appearance of all the styles, you know. You know, Shito is different for Shoto, Wado, Goju. They're all different, you know. And, you know, everybody's on a different pathway. It doesn't matter that there's only one moon to be seen. They're all on different pathways, right? And when she said to me, isn't it all the same? They grab your throat. It's your throat. It's a different throat. The people have different throats. And it was like, and you know from previous conversations, I had been exploring the differences and similarities for many, many years. I've been looking at the, you know, early Greco-Roman gladiatorial style, hand-to-hands, forget the weapons. I was looking at medieval hand-to-hand, not the weapons. I was studying the work of Hans Telhofer and Nicholas Beather, who had collectively brought together all of those medieval works, you know. I had been contrasting that with various fighting arts from different parts of the world, from different early civilizations. I had been cross-comparing it with the early jiu-jitsu practices of books written by Irving Hancock, Uenishi Tani, Kano's early 1895 project on jiu-jitsu, and I just kept seeing the same thing. As I told you, I had a wonderful youth practicing Wing Chun and South Silat, Pukulon, Pajini Kun Tao, and you know, FMA as well. Remy Traces was my stick teacher, you know, and so the idea of two-person practices was always at the forefront of my mind. It's just that the two-person practices I was looking at in karate and kung fu were not, you know, terribly functional, you know, in my opinion. And from about 87, 88, 89, around there, maybe 90, up to maybe 91, I'd been involved with the shoot fighting group in Japan, which are early submission fighters. And at first I was with Saima Satoru's Shuto group, and remarkable person, by the way, really an innovative mind, you know. So we were taking Muay Thai and professional wrestling and fusing it together to come up with no rule type of fighting. It was a little brutal, you know. And then we moved off to Rosai with the UWF. You know, Maeda Akira went one way with Pankratz and we went with the UWFI, and in those days we were using catch-can wrestling with guys like Billy Robinson, Lou Thez, Carl Koch, Jean LaBelle, as really hands-on functional stuff. And I couldn't tell the difference. And you know, I was contrasting that with I remember on one study group was a 1936 publication from Shanghai at the police academy. And I just said, there's no difference in anything. It's all the same, all of it. But the culture has different languages. The protocols and the formal etiquette is different. But when all hell breaks loose in acts of physical violence that are habitual in their culture, nobody's asking what your style is. And I came up with this concept. I said, I'll tell you what, how about if I blindfold you and select a guy from a style that you can't see? So in other words, you cannot physically see the cosmetics or his patch, or you can't hear him talking, and he just puts you in an arm bar or somebody else strangles you. And I said, what style did that to you? You know, kinetic energy doesn't leave a trace signature like a glass of wine, for example. I can't blindfold it, smell the bouquet, look at the film, taste its texture and say, that's a 2014 Cab Sav from Hunter Valley. I can't do that. Kinetic energy doesn't leave a trace signature. And so you needed to focus on the science. Well, here's what I learned from 2 years in the Faculty of Education of trying to break down the walls of cultural enigma. I learned that Focus on science. Fuse it with the art. And a transformative magic happens for everybody. And it's not the same for everybody. Even though the acts of physical violence, they never change. Nor the application principles, the conceptual practices, they never change. But because of, and a term I like to use is the dog in the fight. The fight in the dog and the circumstances in which it occurs. Let's quantify that. Gender, age, physical capacity. Are you a 25-year-old alpha athlete at the peak of physical prowess and 150 kilograms? Or are you 75 years old? Or are you a mentally challenged learner? Are you a female? That's not being discriminatory. That's just saying, that's just talking about the science of what's going to happen in a set of brutal circumstances with a behavior pattern that's not passive and compliant. And so how then are we going to deal with that? And that was what Clem West pulled the plug on. And I went, oh my God, it is all the same. And what's different is now me needing to learn how to quantify that to be able to tell people in Taekwondo, or I don't care if it's Shangguan, Murukwon, it doesn't matter what the style was, because they were just different ways of teaching the same thing. And then on top of that, in, say, the competitive aspect, governed by varying rules and regulations. Look, when I, after 2 years of, and what a wonderful learning experience that was. And then delivering the course was even more educational. But let me get to that in a moment. So before the school years in Australia, I can't speak about the rest of the world, but in Australia, it's usually at the end of a school year, there's, people going out and saying, oh, look at our university, look at our college, and then through the summer months leading into the year coming up is when other colleges or universities will have invitation days for you to go and see, why you should study civil engineering here or physical fitness over there, or nutrition or so on. So we had an open house, and we had many open houses. So I had to come down and speak to a group of people several times a day over the period of a week. And we had a lot of publicity, a lot of magazine publicity in Australia leading up to this course, and much of it was very, very positive. Wow, I will tell you, the day of the first gathering, I could just feel the angry people in the audience staring at me, and the questions were, and look, understandably so, but the questions were things like, what do you know about Taekwondo? What do you know about Chinese Kung Fu? What do you know about Wing Chun, Do Pai, Long Yin, Bap Mei, Choi Li Fada? And I was going, I'll answer you. Yeah, well, what do you know about Chen, Yang, Wu Tai Chi, and everything? Every style, and even some you never even heard of. They were there to ask me, what the hell do you think? Who died and made you the head of anything? And I said, I'm going to say, very, very valuable questions. Thank you so much for asking them. Now, may I have 5 minutes to deliver my response? And they're all, looking at me like this, And I said, well, first of all, I said, I actually do know something about each of the styles that you mentioned, because I've made it my life pursuit to know something about the origins, evolutions of various traditions. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And there's a lot of commonalities. So they're like it's like in anthropology, the cultural anthropology. There's the hero's journey. A lot of these traditions begin with guys who, it's either the revenge or it's the love story, or it's the growing up in poverty, or or being a nobody and being weak and I want to become strong. So they go through this. It's a pathway, and then sooner or later they discover they can be different. And then there's how is it that we become different? And then there's the search, the journey, the arduous journey through the pathway until they get to a point where there's a source. And then they pursue it in whatever capacity to become the recipient and empowered by that source. And then, of course, it's the coming back into normality and delivering that lesson to everybody else. And the giving is the getting, and this is a circle. I get it. And styles have come and gone over the generations in this capacity. And there's lots of famous stories. The Kung Fu is the Wong Fei Hong and the Shaolin. Anyway, and so I said, I may not know the history of your tradition, but what we're talking about is the way in which you deliver your target lessons in your school, whether it's a mogun, a dojang, a dojo, a gym, or just the yagai geigo outside. You can't haphazardly teach unless it's just for fun. If someone is under your guidance and you're mentoring them through a pathway for given outcomes, they will be rewarded for bodies of information that they will be tested on, that are leading them to a larger goal, to become, I don't know, a competitive athlete, a better human being, a competent fighter of self-defense. Whatever, you're grooming them to take over your tradition, whatever it happens to be, you can't just haphazardly deliver lessons that are not theoretically based. They have to be theoretically based for these, and these reasons. They have to be methodically set out in lesson plannings so that you're able to measure progress. Measurement becomes the constant in being able to look back and determine how far you have come. And that helps establish the handicap from which to move forward and what to be tested on. Risk injury management has to be part of what you're doing, because the nature of what we do, sooner or later, is going to become physically aggressive. And even if it wasn't, how about if somebody just accidentally slipped and fell while trying to kick someone to the head or do the splits or something like that? They pull a muscle, or they have a hernia, or someone has a heart attack. You're dying. What do you do? I don't know. So these are responsibilities and obligations that you as an instructor, irrespective of what style you come from, have to know how to do. So the lesson planning, the risk management, these are just small parts of other things. Not everybody gets the same lesson the same way to achieve the same outcome, because children don't learn the same way adults do. Girls don't get it the same way boys do. Again, it's not discriminatory, it's science. It's a fact. And even though a bladder air depression, a strangle or a choke, understanding its dynamics, the science behind it, will convey to an important body of information about how and why it's dangerous. Armed with that fundamental information, you will now better understand the mechanics and the principles that support the manipulation of the mechanics and the transfer of energy to support your form, your taolu, or your sing, or your punsei, or your kata, or your routine, in how to effectively negotiate that. So there's so much more to running a school and being an instructor and conveying information and being responsible for the safety and growth in education. And that is to say nothing of the psychology behind instructional skills, where my job is to empower a person, not to criticize them to death, or not to diminish their capacity to learn and grow, but to empower the person. And to recognize that they might be having a problem in this area. That's not a slight on me or an insult to my ego. Your ego cannot be involved when you're teaching. Your job is to be concerned and care exclusively for the success of this person's future. And so, 45 minutes later, everybody's going, when can we get started? And I want to tell you, it was just a remarkable learning experience. And where I said, like as I say, I don't know much about the cosmetic appearance behind, Murakwan or Tang Soo or, Charlie Fat or something like that. But what I do know is that in order to generate enough kinetic energy to a target zone, say with your fist, or you picked your tool. Is it going to be an elbow, a finger a headbutt, a bite? You can only, there's only, in the effective negotiating of any act of physical violence, it can fall into two particular categories. Percussive impact, you pick the tool, which is transferring the energy, and or seizing, because all of those areas, joint manipulation, limb entanglement, blood and air deprivation, balance displacement, escapes and counters against everything, fighting on the ground. They all have to do with these 5 ancient machines. And the 5 ancient machines are supported by a body of immutable principles. Go read Isaac Newton or Archimedes, or, these things have all been written long before you and I have ever come together. So it's our job to learn to come into contact with the infinite as it applies to the passionate and bring it together. That's the science meeting the art. And that's that common thread I always speak about that fuses together that which can bring us together, as opposed to that which separates us. So the acts of physical violence, and what I mean by that, choke, strangles, headlocks, hair pulls, being hit, struck in any way that you can possibly imagine. I'm not talking about standing back at distance and calling you out. Come on, let's dance. Look, I know, especially with the male psyche, there's every reason in the world to believe that a young person will want to take you up on that. And that's got to do with that ego-related distractions of youth and the lack of that moral compass. Yeah, you want to, okay, let's go. That's not self-defense. Now, you might ultimately have to be fighting for your life. That is not self-defense in a traditional sense. Self-defense is when you do not have a choice and you are already seized and in the progress of being assaulted. Or somebody comes over and quickly hit you. Yeah, I got this other guy, one of the haters, who plagiarized my early work on this happy theory. Oh, the reason ours is different from yours. Oh, really? What is it? Well, we look at all the pre-issues before the fight happens. I said, well, then call it something else, because that's not habitual act of physical violence. Doesn't have to be. Okay, I'll meet you in 5 minutes out back because I'm going to think about how it's going to, or you confront me. It's not about that at all. It's about me not being prepared for it, but yet being prepared for it. Take case in point. I say to you, okay, how do you effectively deal with, having a garment pull over your head and punching you in the face? Oh, we don't do that in my style. Or, the referee would, whatever. Well, first of all, we're not talking about a sport. We're talking about you in your car at a red light, waiting for it to change, and somebody yanking your door open and grabbing you and throwing you out. Or jumping in with you. Or you're at an ATM machine, you get jumped from behind. Okay, 500 years ago, they didn't have an ATM machine, but you could still get jumped from behind. You could still be young, old, female, male, blind, intoxicated, all of the conditions in humanity. Those acts of violence that are habitually in human nature still were being perpetuated. So it didn't matter if it's 500 years ago or right now. It all works the same way. So it's either you know how to effectively negotiate these quantifiable acts of physical violence, or you do not. And to the folks out there who would think, yeah, well, okay, he knows everything. You can never tell what the guy's going to do. Wouldn't it be great if you could? I agree with you. And, whenever you can stop time and go back and look at it, it'd be a great idea. But here's the second best thing. If I get seized right away because of this pathway, and I'm going to explain the pathway in a minute. If I get seized anywhere in my body, I know exactly what to do. and why I know what to do with it. And it doesn't matter, grab, shove, headlock, bear hug from the back, over the arms, under the arms, from the side, over one arm, whichever capacity happens to be. Tackle, shove, thrown down, on my back, on my side mount, north, south, strangle, whatever happens to be, whatever act of physical violence it happens to be. Why I can negotiate it, and why you can learn how to negotiate it as well, is because it's part of a timeless pathway. And it has been a part of a timeless pathway for generations. So the question to ask them would be, well, why aren't we doing it now? Well, in many regards, we are doing it now. A lot of researchers who have kind of broken out from they say they've broken out from the tradition. It's interesting, Bruce Lee was, at the forefront of that. He look outside the fighting arts. I said, look inside the fighting arts instead. You don't need to look outside. If you look inside the kata, that's where you will discover the heavenly glory. It's all here. And so the point simply being this, is if you learn how and why an act of violence is dangerous, it arms you with the fundamental understanding of how the principles work against it. The variables being the circumstances, who you are and who that person is. The size, age, gender thing, okay? So, but the acts, they don't change at all. How you negotiate these immutable principles, that is, and that becomes the pathway. And now let's talk about the pathway for a moment, okay? Because the pathway represented how I was able to bring together judo, taekwondo, karate, kung fu, Southeast Asian, sambo, all of it, into an instructor's training program that focused on science and art. And so I thought, I wonder how, challenged with various people's understanding or lack of understanding of what there is to know about creating this dispassionate look at the fighting arts so we can all kind of be on board, seeing the same thing. I said, okay, I come up with let me call it my Pat's art class metaphor. Hi class, welcome to Pat's arts class. I'm Pat. I'm going to be your instructor today. How many of you have painted before? No one. Oh, good. That's great. Okay, so anyway, before you see a bunch of brushes, right? You'll notice that the end of the brushes are all different. One's really big and bushy. That's for painting like clouds and big mountains and things like that, right? And then there's various grades from big down to small, and the little tiny ones here, you can see, look at that little tiny. They're for doing eyelashes and eyebrows and little dots and things like that, okay? Over here, you've got these are scrapers. They give you texture, and then, oh, that's my rag, sorry. Yeah, I use it sometimes, to massage in the clouds and get the big waves. You can do that too. We call them rags. Otherwise, all the rest of the stuff is pretty standard. There's pastels, there's watercolors, there's oil, and we use a palette to put the colors on before we start to create our painting. And the last thing I want to show you is this big white thing. Anybody know what it's called? What? Anybody? James, what is it?
Canvas.
It's the canvas. And everybody has one. You can even call your life a canvas if you will, because you're the person behind painting or drawing the picture upon which you will live. So the lesson for today is paint a rose. You've got 30 minutes. Good luck. And what happens at the end of 30 minutes when I ask them to hand in their roses? Keep in mind now, they all had the same paint, the same brushes, the same canvas, the same palette. Everything was the same. And I didn't make it difficult. I said, paint a rose. Why is it then we get 50, so there's 50 people in class or 20, take your pick. Why is it then we get 50 different roses at the end of the class from the same thing? So I'm speaking to the individuality of what it is that brings us together. Kinetic energy transfer. You either know how to accelerate a limb into a chosen target to create the outcome you want, or you don't. And you know, jabbing your fingers into someone's eyes is not the same as banging them with a right hand. And the idea that an attacker is standing right in front of you, that's a luxury. And if you could hit them with Big Mama, that's a gift. The unpredictability and randomness of physical violence in reality is a messy, brutal, violent thing. You don't have any of this time to paint. You have to respond instinctively. And in the moments in between that you're not laying unconscious on the ground, or you're lucky enough to be seized, in that moment, you go then to your training. So whatever training it is that conditions your body, cultivates your mind, and nurtures your spirit, you better hope that the practices, the two-person practices that put you on this pathway are highly functional. What I mean to say is, after you have learned the act of violence, and then rehearsed it back and forth with different partners at different times, in passive resistance and with a compliant partner, you can feel comfortable enough with it that you can join the next phase of learning, which is a graduated scale of aggressive resistance. So much so that the ability to get a timeless or a time-honored application, counter, or response to it to work fails. And the failure and the inability to get it to work every time becomes the lesson itself. And that's where the tweaking becomes important. That's where the mentorship of whoever if it's the sifu, the sensei, the shihan, the shiduen, the daisifu, sabun, guru, whoever it happens to be, is mentoring you. The person is not blinded by, and I'm not going to use the word tradition, because I think tradition is something that should bring you to life, not something that should confine you. Lars Anderson, thank you, Lars, a colleague of mine in Denmark, came up with the very same idea. Tradition is not about holding you back. We know that tradition is not about blindly following the men of old, or concealing their ashes in a box in the haka. It's about continuing to pursue that which they pursued. Classic learning is timeless. It's time-honored. But tradition is about continually seeking out better and more succinct ways of doing the same thing, of achieving the same outcome. And that's why contemporary insight with classical learning is the pathway of tradition. It's not about confining you, it's about encouraging you. And that's why, when we look back at Confucian values, I think the heritage needs to be reevaluated with contemporary thought. It's like the metaphor about a pond. If a pond doesn't have a continual source flowing into and refreshing the pond, it becomes stagnant and dies. When Bruce Lee said, rid yourself of the classical mess, he wasn't saying that's no good. He was saying that because of this Confucian-based mindset that's misunderstood, every generation produce innovative minds who, in an effort to keep their traditions a living experience for the community that they serve, reinterpret the common principles upon which it rests, and in doing so, create more innovative ways of accomplishing the very same outcomes. So back to the pathway. You've learned how to negotiate a mount, somebody taking your back, a rear naked choke, a front single, double manual choke, impacted in every way you can possibly be imagined, grabbed and impacted, garments over your head, thrown to the ground. And you have learned it through this graduated pathway with all different types of partners, failing almost at every single corner, but learning all of the acts of physical violence that are quantifiable. And then bringing them together. You know, when I say cross swords, well, in the old days, they used to cross hands. And if it started with a shoving match back and forth, the only time it stopped is when you were disconnected. Because disconnected meant there's no threat. The threat had to be from touching. Touch, see, punch, all of that perfectly fine. So this idea of two-person engagement is the pathway. Pliable and not aggressive to begin with. What? I love my children. I don't want them harmed, but I want them to ride a bicycle and drive a car. But I don't just put them on a bicycle and shoot them down a hill right away. Because if I do it, there's a good chance they're going to get hurt. When I'm responsible for teaching someone, I don't want them harmed or hurt in any way. I want to empower them. So I want to make sure that their learning curve is precious and later reflected upon as indelible. They learn in a way that empowers them. And even when they fail, Sensei told me I would fail sooner or later, and now I failed. What an important lesson. So to empower the person after they fail and show them how to ultimately tweak the principles or the mechanics to get it to work, and then gradually to exponentially invest their practice with more aggressive resistance, that's where the lesson really exists. I've culminated in my lifetime 7 sets of exercises that bring together every form of percussive impact you can possibly imagine, with the receptions of how to receive it, respond, capture, and control. Another set of drills, the Kansetsu Tuite, which show you joint manipulations and limb entanglements of every limb in the body, and how to dig into the cavities of the body unprotected by the skeletal structure. There's 72 two-person practices in one culminated drill. When you separate them, for example, you would see things like, oh my God, you know, oh, that's a move from this and this, of course. Because if you take the two-person drills, those of throwing, those of grappling on the ground, those of clinch-related, joint manipulation, limb entanglement, chokes, all of the, if you take the drills that you've mastered after a period of many years of training, you don't get this in 1 or 2 years, you know. And then you separate them and you look at the fighting application, you ritualize it into a little miniature template. You can take those templates and link them to other templates into a geometrical configuration to create something greater than the sum total of its individual parts. And that, my friends, is what is kata. So the kata becomes the art. The art becomes the kata. Well, and look, whether it's called kata or something, punsei or hyung or something, that's another thing. And so this crossing of the hands, what we call riai tegumi. And by the way, so before styles had names, you know, you hear this tomari shiri nate. Well, I will tell you that, you know, I know how much time we have today. Please ask me to explain that to you. That's not an ancient theory, by the way. And tomarite wasn't any different from shirite. Oh, they're tall, skinny, flat. They can, no. The acts of violence are all the same everywhere in the world. Why should the training methods used to overcome them be any different? So what happened in history that prevents us from understanding this today? And I have to tell you that from around 1840 till the Boxers' Rebellion, and then into the early portion of the 20th century, from the Boxers' Rebellion, from the Opium Wars to the Boxers' Rebellion, there's a period of Chinese history that's rarely talked about. And it was with the advent and popularization of firearms, particularly with commoners. We saw this type of martial art training fall quietly dormant in lieu of people just shooting you. Summed up in the movie, a couple of movies on that now. You know, what was it, the Harrison Ford, and so he pulls out the gun and shoots a guy. I mean, you think about that for a moment. You spent your entire life training, and a guy pulls out and shoots you. And the rampant collection of firearms in China was reason enough for people to shift their attention to something else. And then, in the dawn of the 20th century, because of the Japanese occupation in Formosa and Manchukuo and places, you saw then this German concept of swordsmanship and wrestling being brought in to give life, if you will, to Kendo and Judo on the mainland. And then Itosu Anko here in Okinawa jumping on that bandwagon to use conceptually the same idea by modifying old and larger practices into modules for large groups of students in the school system in support of Japan's war machine during a time of radical military escalation. We saw the transition from kata being once used to culminate lessons already learned in two-person drills to being embraced as a form of group calisthenics to focus on physical fitness and social conformity. So in that period of time, we saw the demise of one understanding and the rise of another one to give popularity, which would later, in post-war years, bring a popularity to something that none of us had ever seen before. And even though we've only skimmed over a smattering of this history, I want to take you back to this process. Like, can you imagine Funagoshi Gichin, when trying to explain the value of kata on the mainland of Japan with folks who had never done the Okinawan art before? They were comparing what they were learning from Funakoshi in kata. And please remember that the karate of the 1920s wasn't what we know today. Kihon, kumite, no. It was only kata. There wasn't any basics. Basic Kihon, as you and I know it today, were developed in the 20s by guys like Konishi Yasuhiro, Otsuka Hironori. Those are the pioneers of Kihon Waza. They didn't come from Okinawa. The Japanese wanting to break things down and compartmentalize them and then deliver them in a graduated system to get you to a kata. That's Japanese, that's not Okinawa. And so this idea, and just as a matter of fact, you didn't learn step 1, 2, 3, and let's repeat it. Now let's add 4, 5, and 6. No. In those days, you followed the leader over and over and over and over, and that was the class. And guys like Konishi and Otsuka and others started the question, well, where's the happy ending? You know, in Kendo, you know, we learned how to hold the shinai. You know, we learned the sabaki. You know, and we learned the tsuki, men, kote, and do, and then we gear up and we fight. In judo, we learn, you know, also some sabaki, ashi sabaki, and of course tai sabaki. And we learn this kazushi, this concept about balance. We learn, you know, we learn the entries and the setup and the execution. We learn the ukemi waza, you know, we learn the uchikomi, and then they just let us go. We ran dori. But in karate, it's kata, 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 kata. Like, where's the prize? So the idea of the kihon was developed. Then the idea, well, if I did this, you'd have to do this or you'd die. So then the uke waza, the uke, not the block, the reception from the tori, the giver. That's another confusing part about karate, a lesson for another time, is if I struck you here, kicked you there, chopped you there, without you blocking it, you'd die. So, you know, when they demonstrate, you know, you got Takano no Saburo, Nakayama Hakudo, especially in their EI, they say the EI, they're doing the two-man kata, I attack, and I do keisagiri, and then I cut, you know, and then boom, you know, I kiai, I do the zanshin, we go back, chiburi, and where was that in karate? So Ippon, Nihon, Sanbon, Kumite were developed that led down the road to Jio Kumite. And therein, along with the, you know, the criteria set forth by the powers of be at the time, the Japanese Budo community, headed out of the Dainapan Butokai in Kyoto, Butokoden at the time. You know, get a uniform that you can practice in. So we'll borrow it from judo. The belt, the Daikyu system, getting rid of the ideogram that referred to an area that we didn't like across the sea. Get rid all the jutsus were being replaced with the michi, the do, the pathway, which was adhering to the Japanese Budo culture. So Totei Jutsu became Karate Do. Only one style, one fashion, one flavor, just like Kendo and Judo. And so it is in that historical overview that we see the demise of an old tradition and the birth of a new tradition. And the new tradition then becoming dormant because of the war years, and then not being started back up again till the 50s, mid to late 50s, but then serving as a bridge to link cultures together. Budo, of which karate is an integral part, like Kendo, Judo, Aikido, and so on, would become a mechanism through which foreign people could learn more about Japanese culture. And in doing so, West would meet East and East would meet West in a safe learning environment and become friends. Like we say in Okinawa, Ichariba Chodi. Even though we may only meet once, we are friends for life. And the Budo, whether it's the tatami or the dojo floor, was an area where we could come together in conflict, but learn control. And learn how to utilize that control to become better people. And in becoming better people, we would make the world a safer place or a better place. And so that conceptual philosophy then is one that continues to serve these fighting arts as a wonderful mechanism through which to cultivate the mind and to nurture the spirit while conditioning the body and providing a safe passageway so that when you receive and get to the other side of your life, you can look back and say, that was a life well lived. And I think that's what they mean when they say, what is the pathway of Budo? What does it give you? What is this? So there's lots of styles today. And people often ask, what do you do, McCarthy? What's Koryū Uchinādi? So Koryū Uchinādi is a term that my teacher, my Okinawan teacher, helped me come up with. As I traveled the world and taught in over 60 countries for 30 years, I kept being confronted with, what's the style? What's the style? What's the style? So my background is in Shorin-ryu. So I'm a Shorin-ryu stylist. It's interesting because I actually have worked more with Shotokan stylists and found more of an affinity with my Goju brothers than I have with my Shorin-ryu roots. But the real truth is this, is that if you go back far enough, you'll find there were no styles. There are only conceptual practices against acts of physical violence that are habitual in human nature. So that's old school. And how we say old school in a formalized way is ko. Ko is made of two parts of one ideogram. Ju is the top part and kuchi is the bottom part. So the etymology when you bring it together means 10. Speaking means 10. So something that's been handed down for a long time. And Ryu with the sansui represents stream, which metaphorically represents something that comes from a source and flows down. So it's an old source that's come down for generations. Koryū. The problem with some of my detractors with the term is they think that it disrespects a term they've created on the mainland to express traditions created before the Meiji period. Those are Koru or Buge. I made it perfectly clear, this is not the Koru or Buge. Actually, technically, it probably is. But I don't have a direct lineage back to the 14th century. Like, for example, I'm also a swordsman from Tenshin Shorin Katori Shinto Ryu, and I can call this Koru. And I have a direct lineage. But karate has no direct lineage as such. And so because of that, one group are a little bit angry at me for, I'm not worried too much about that. Do nothing, say nothing, you'll have no detractors, okay? Uchinādi, as you know, is the way that this art was described a long time ago. Uchina are inside people. D is te in Hogen, Uchinaguchi. Or otherwise I could call it Koryū Uchinādi. But there's a fusion here of several cultures, as you know, Southeast Asia, Korea, China with Japan in Okinawa. And Okinawa itself is a wonderfully unique culture at the same time. So Southeast Asia, Korea, China, Japan coming all together, it became a melting pot for different conceptual practices by different people at different times over the period of many generations. So Koryū Uchinādi doesn't represent the style at all. It represents a body, a collection, a systematized collection of two-person practices which deliver the lessons that you've invited me to speak about this evening.